Hi, students. In the next few lectures, we are going to look at the topic of migration. We, of course, are going to link this to some of the information that we learned in the population chapter, and we're also going to tie it into development, which I believe is chapter 10 of the 12th edition of our textbook, if you're working from that 12th edition. And so we're going to link these topics in the next few lessons and kind of weave some more fabric into our story that we're telling in human geography class this semester. So, migration, I don't have a whole lot on the board back here behind me because in this weekly folder, I have an item that's typed out that gives you some definitions for some of these things. But in general, I want to make sure that we're on the right page about what migration actually means and refers to. Migration is about movement of people, but it has some idea of permanence to it. It isn't simply what happens in our day-to-day lives when we get up and move from the location of our homes to work, school, shopping, whatever it is that we have to do, and then go back again. It's not appropriate to use the word, oh, I've migrated here or there, because it has a degree of permanence. You are leaving one place and you are going to another location with the idea of staying there. And so that's going to have a dramatic impact on populations from one place to the next. When you have portions of the population intentionally leaving or intentionally entering for the purpose of taking up residence in a new space. Any other type of movement is certainly interesting in the activity spaces that we have in our daily lives, whether you go on vacation or whether you have a contract to work on an oil rig for a specific unit of time and then you're back. That kind of movement in Mr. Help is called cyclic movement. So there's a concept in your textbook in chapter 3, a term called a snowbird, and this is a term that usually refers to older retired couples who maybe live in the northern states where there's a lot of snow and cold winters. And after retirement, they might prefer to keep their home that they have in those northern states, but instead go to someplace like Florida or Alabama or California, someplace warm during the winter months so that they can avoid all of the snow. And so there's those factors, but they would not be called migrants. They would not be immigrating for just that 3-month period of time. They would intend to go back to their original place of residence. So that's different than migration that has the idea of a permanent relocation. So look up these definitions, these official definitions in our textbook. Some of them I've included in that little notes section in our weekly folder. But there are a couple of different words, and I'm going to try to give you a trick to remember what they are. But regarding migration, sometimes a person leaves a place where they are from to move elsewhere, and that has a particular word. If a person is leaving a place, they're exiting the place, then you spell immigrant with an E, as I have it spelled on the board back here. If a person is coming into a place to take up residence, you spell that word with an I. So they're an immigrant in that way. And so you'll see these two words used, not interchangeably, but they'll be used throughout our chapter about specific directions of the movement that's taking place. I am permanently exiting this place so that I can permanently enter or go into another place. And so immigrant with an I, you're going into a place for the purpose of staying there. Immigrant with an E, you're exiting your original location with the intention of not residing there anymore. And then there's different types of migration that we're going to talk about. I have chain migration on the board behind me. I want to be sure and address this one because from a geography standpoint, chain migration is simply a pattern in which one person perhaps leaves their original place, they exit. One person of a family unit perhaps leaves the original place. in for what reason. Maybe it's job, maybe it's a climate reason, maybe it's whatever the reasons are. We'll talk about push and pull factors in another video. But whatever the reason is, maybe one person leaves and goes to the place where they want to permanently relocate. When they get there, they start that first link in the chain, literally, whereas they write home for somebody else. They send remittances. There's another vocabulary word from chapter 3. They send remittances, money, back to their original home place where they still have people who intend to also migrate and join them later. And one by one, or two or three at a time, people who are left behind are able to link to that anchor that they have in that new location and come and join and resettle in another permanent location. But instead of an entire group going at once, maybe one, then two, three, four come and join the original person. And so chain migration, I wanted to be sure and mention it to you, because if you just do a general Google search for this term, you will see a lot of really, really inflammatory kind of political statements about chain migration, because it is a hot button topic in politics today, and you won't really see anything. I did a couple of searches on a couple of different search engines, and you don't really see anything that is simply informative that presents this word in an objective point of view. There is just a very, very subjective representation of chain migration, either for it or against it. And if you are for it or against it, you are vehemently so. One of those things. So a couple of other things that we'll look at: step migration. That often happens it can happen in an internal or external, so either within a nation or in an international setting. Step migration is you maybe start out in one particular place and it's not possible for you, for whatever reason, to go all the way to your ultimate goal destination, but you can get there maybe one country at a time, one state at a time, one place at a time, and settle semi-permanently in order to regroup, get more resources, earn more money so that you can make the next step toward your goal. And literally you can think of it as steps toward a goal. You start one place and you want to go to this other place, but you have to take intermediary steps along the way in order for that permanent move to be successful for you. One of my favorite American novels is by a guy named Richard Wright. It's called Black Boy, and he talks about, it's semi-biographical. He talks about a boy from Mississippi who grows up in terrible, terrible poverty, and he's from the outskirts in the rural areas of Mississippi, and he gets to go to Jackson, and he talks about the different lifestyle that Jackson offered to him. And then he gets to go to Memphis and how that opened new doors. And then he gets to go to Chicago and Detroit. And so his story of his whole life is really a wonderful American novel about step migration within the internal area of the United States, the 48 United States. Okay. Forced migration, of course, is something that you will know, a more common word you will know is slavery. And so there are all sorts of forms of slavery that have existed throughout the world. Throughout history and throughout the world. But the most common one, of course, that you and I are aware of in the United States is African slavery and the African slave trade, because that was the dominant form that existed in the United States, sanctioned by law, existed in the United States a couple of centuries ago, before it was abolished. And so there are some flow maps that I want to direct you to in chapter 3 that show specifically about that African diaspora. Diaspora is think of it as the word dispersal, where you go from one place to the next. So this forced migration were people unwillingly leaving because they were part of the economy of slavery, and they were shipped out literally like a good from one port of call to the next. And so there's a very good flow map that I think, because the thickness of the arrows that show the origination point and the destination point, it can show you the volume, the number of people who were transported from Africa to places in South America got the majority of people. The Caribbean got the next highest amount, and then the United States and Canada. And then also it shows a little bit to England, who went to England from the ports along the western coast of Africa. Of course, African slaves were forcibly transported from other parts of Africa, North Africa and Eastern Africa, into Asia and into the Middle East. And so the African slave trade was not simply a phenomenon that occurred on American soil, but all over the world. And it's a very recent one in history. And so we have these maps where we can show you the volume and the time frame of this forced migration. And of course, that changes populations significantly over time. So when we were talking about birth rates and death rates and natural increase rates in population in previous lectures, it did not at all consider migration patterns and how population numbers and population composition can change a lot over time when we collect this data, not merely because people are being born and dying in the nation, but also because migrants come in for a variety of reasons to that place with the idea of permanently staying there, which changes the ultimate culture of a place because of the diffusion of those cultural traits that they came from their original place, brought them to the new place. And so a lot of cultural diffusion and assimilation occurs, and there are permanent footprints, so to speak, on the former culture and the new culture when migrants of different languages, races, religious belief systems, etc., mingle with pre-existing populations. Okay, so in the next video, we will talk about push and pull factors that are part of the decision-making process that people use when they willingly migrate. Now, sometimes people have to migrate for climate reasons or something like that. Like Montserrat is a little island nation in the Caribbean that everyone had to leave because of a volcano, right? Like there's another forced, unwilling migration thing that doesn't have to do with slavery. But we're going to talk about the push and pull factors of choice, and sometimes that force us to make a choice to leave a place and reside in another one. So I'll see you then.